Okay. Hello, and welcome to my first ever live stream here at Crickenford, where we're going to talk about some very popular opinions that misunderstand myth. And I'll probably go off in a few other directions as I normally do. Anyway, being live, feel free to ask questions and I will approach them when I get breaks in what I'm talking about. But hopefully you'll enjoy the evening and I'll try and treat it like one of my normal lecture type videos, but as I say, I will keep an eye on the questions. Now, I also want to say, one, can you hear me? If someone can say yes, that's good. If no one says yes, then I will fix the problem. Anyone? Yes, excellent, marvellous. Thank you, Wayne's World of Science and Technology, and Jonathan and everybody. Excellent, excellent. So that's good. I don't know where I'm going. So yes, so let's start at the very beginning. I've sort of made notes so I don't go too off the trail. So as I say, I'm going to talk primarily about Jordan Peterson and Graham Hancock, and I've chosen those two because they tend to be quite polarizing. People either like them or hate them, and they do have some views on mythology. Now, what I'm not going to do here is be derogatory to them, and I don't want anybody to be derogatory about them, whether you believe in their opinion or not. This is an analysis of how they talk about myth and the challenges I see in that, and we'll bring out hopefully some very good points, especially with Peterson, because I feel he almost contradicts himself a few times. And the chats I'm going to look at are the ones where Peterson was talking to Richard Dawkins, Alex O'Connor, the cosmic skeptic, and Jonathan Pageau, I think his name is, who's a good friend of Jordan and Christian. And for Hancock, I've probably taken a couple of quotes from his chat with Lex Friedman's podcast, which was quite interesting. I mean, Lex wasn't really pushing back on Graham's views, so I felt Graham was probably a bit more open. Although saying that, if you've kept up to speed with what's happening in the Hancock arena ever since his chat on Joe Rogan with Flint Dibble, there's been quite a lot of mud slinging going across the internet and accusations of lies and lies about lies. So it's a very interesting time in terms of archaeology on the internet. Well worth keeping an eye on. I'm not too sure where quite to sit in terms of who is speaking the absolute truth. I think there's probably been a couple of misguided quotes by both parties, but maybe accidental, maybe on purpose. Who knows? So I'll just quickly check the comments. Everybody can hear me. No. So do I need to address people like Peterson? I don't feel this from Death Hearth. I don't feel like there is a need to address Peterson, but because he is so popular, and when I actually watched him talk, it really irked me. I mean, the things he said, I just found astounding, and I'll bring those up. So I just feel if other people are thinking like that, or even if, let's say, Jordan Peterson ever watches this, maybe he will one day, and he wants to seek advice on how to present his narrative in a more acceptable way to academia, then this would be of use. And I'm here to teach rather than sort of be an internet celebrity. So happily talk to him on or offline if that ever should happen. This shouldn't be controversial. I'm hoping it shouldn't be controversial, not from my understanding, but I may upset a few fans of Hancock or Peterson if they're here, or indeed I may make them happier because as I say, I'm not here to make derogatory comments about either of them. This will be, as I say, hopefully information that will allow them, if they ever listen to it, to make a better story of what they're saying. We have Crowhag here, so I want to say thank you to my dear friend Crowhag, who's moderating the chat. So, as I say, please be nice. There's no need for any horrible comments. She will hide you or ban you or whatever if you aren't nice. So there we go. Thank you, JM. JM has donated $2. Thank you, much appreciated. You don't have to, but thank you very much. So, catching a live one, yes, it's my first ever live one, so forgive any technical difficulties I have. So before we start, if I asked you all, what do you think a myth is? Apart from the people who watch me a lot, I'm pretty sure you would all give different answers. You'll probably say there's something like they are fictional stories. And some of you may even say they hold elements of the truth, maybe historical truth or esoteric knowledge or something like that. But the fact is, the term myth is a word that can mean many things to many people. And this may be one of the reasons why I believe it is misunderstood by people, because they're not necessarily holding it in the same shape as I would see a myth. And that's fair enough, but then how they consider a myth should be defined if someone's going to talk about it. Now, I've spoken about it a lot, and I will briefly go over what a myth is later. But I think perhaps what would be interesting is just to discuss a couple of things about history and the history of mythology, and in the sense that the history of the study of mythology, because that will allow us to put some of the things I'll probably talk about today in better context. Now, I guess one of the things we need to do is, when we think about the past, is actually try and put ourselves in the shoes of those people who stood there 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, or whenever, because the world was a very different place then. People thought of things very differently. Certainly, pre-Christian cultures had a far more sacred view of the world, and I can touch on that in a little bit. But we need to understand what their drivers were, what their needs were, because that allows us to understand how they would, in effect, place an importance on myth, and whether they considered them really true and held truths as we talk about. Now, the other thing, perhaps is really is an interesting thought, is that if you actually rewound history, let's say you rewound history 3,000 years and played it again, and you did that 100 times, have you ever thought about how many times things like Christianity would actually happen? Because I don't think it would have happened much at all, and therefore Islam less likely, and even more modern things like Russia becoming communist. They're just little parts of history that are influenced off the beaten track, or influenced by off the beaten path, I guess, because history doesn't really go in the direction we expect it to. That's for many reasons, but there are just so many influences on history, and that's really worth understanding. So when people say, why do things happen? Why did people, let's say, believe in Christ or believe in a particular myth or religion? Sometimes we don't actually know, because it doesn't make sense. History just does all its influences force it to do. So I just want you to be maybe aware of that too, that some things that have been and seem absolute are just luck. And thank you, Andreas Peterson, for the cup of tea money. That's much appreciated. Let me just have any quick questions while I've talk about that. It's a good price. Right, okay. but there are some questions which I'll get to at the end of the talk. So, what I'd like to first talk about is, how did people in the past view myth? Did they consider them important or not? And then I can talk about the history of the study of myth. And I think it's Bruce Lincoln who wrote a great piece on this, and he talks about how the Romans called myth fabulae, so they considered them fiction. So, and when we talk about the Romans thought something, and you hear this a lot, not all Romans thought that, and we only talk about Romans in sort of, I guess, around the 2,000 years ago mark. So, sort of period of a couple hundred years either side of that. So, many Romans thought myth fiction, and their influence, the Greeks, they actually categorized myth into two types, mythos and logos. And mythos were myths really about the actions of people, such as things that happen in war, battles. I would almost argue very patriarchal type things, and logos was more matriarchal type things, and so they were more likely to believe the mythos than the logos. So we do see already 2,500 years ago or so the the the, the feelings from some of Greek society that myth wasn't real. And that's quite interesting, because that's just after the time Homer had written the Iliad and the Odyssey. And whilst they are myths, they do contain information about the gods and how people behave. Many people may have considered them just stories at this point. We won't ever know how many or the section, but again, it's something to think about, that there's always been, people with different views of myth. So that's I think, well worth noting. So the other thing I want to talk about before we look at Peterson and Hancock's views is the history of the study of mythology. That's really important, because if you understand that, it'll answer a lot of questions some people have about some of the things myths make people in society doing, in particular cultures. And it all really started around 1500, the year 1500, about 500 years ago, when there was a chap by the name of Piccolo Mini, who went on to be Pope Pius II, I believe. And at this time, taking into account everything I've said, the world thought that the Mediterranean was the center of civilization, where civilization sprang up. So the Greeks and the Romans, the Egyptians, the Near East, Anatolia, these were the places where civilization started, culture started, and everybody should look up to the people from this part of the world. And moreover, there was a feeling from those people in the Mediterranean that people elsewhere were just barbarians. They had lacked culture. And this was especially view of, let's say, the Roman Empire's view of the Germanic-speaking people. They thought they were just barbarians. And even today, there's that feeling. Netflix had the Barbarian series about that. But what happened in 1500 with Piccolo Mini is he was studying manuscripts and came across Marcus Aurelius's manuscript, we call Germania, which was a historical text about the tribes of Germania. And he talked about a few particular tribes, which I talk about a lot in other videos, and their reference and how they're made up. But they certainly were very much Indo-European influenced in terms of culture. And if you haven't read Germania, it basically said these people had culture. These people had good family organizations, they had rituals, and they weren't barbarians. Now, on hearing this, obviously the Germanic speaking people thought, yes, that's brilliant. We are no longer seen as the sort of poor boy of civilization. We have a culture, and that created some kind of national identity, even though Germany wasn't in effect created at that point, as we know it today. It gave people who felt they were Germanic, a belief that actually our ancestors were good people, cultured people. And then shortly after this, we find the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, which were texts of Old Norse mythology, so what we consider Scandinavian mythology. They were then discovered. And then the Scandinavians realized that there's this beautiful poetry suggesting these people, again, had culture and good relationships and weren't the barbarians that people thought. And then this just naturally progressed, and everybody then wanted their own mythology. And you see the likes of epic poems being written all across Europe and into Asia, from Armenia to Finland. I mean, the Kalevala was written literally as a response to this growth of national mythology. We see in England, Bede, he wrote the classical history of the English people, and that is really a creation myth for the English. And he did it to create credibility that this is why the English people are here and they deserve to be here. In fact, they established that, and it's probably summarized well in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. But literally everything before 700 CE, when it started to be written in historic terms, is all myth, all absolutely made up from tales, which upsets a few people who believe in their national pride and things like that. But it is absolute myth. And so I sort of blame the study of mythology for a rise in nationalism. And I could probably write a whole book on the history of the study of mythology, which I may do one day. So, yeah, I wanted to just let you know this to give you some context of what we're talking about and why myths are there and why we wanted to study them, and why I do what I do. And in fact, for anybody watching this and they don't know who I am, I don't know if there is anyone here, I'm John F. White. I am the curator of the Mythology Database. I am sort of retired. I'm trying to be retired, but I do work and have worked for a number of universities or faculty and students this year from a number of universities across the world, including some of the world's leading universities, helping them study myth and use data from the Mythology Database. And we're doing some great work there. So that is, in a way, the reason why perhaps you may want to listen to me saying what I'm saying. I am, I think, well regarded in terms of providing mythological data to academia. Now, before I get on and start talking about Hancock or Peterson, I don't know who you want first, let me just have a little check of the questions to see if anybody's asked anything that I can answer quickly. Hancock likes to use flood myths. Yes, I'll talk about Hancock in a minute and his myths. Did Homer and the Gospels, for example, record all traditions, or were they writing themselves the source? There's a question. I think if Captain Deadpool's on here, he'll probably have a comment about this. But there is some thought that the Gospels contain influence from Greek myth, and I'll talk about that a bit more when I talk about Peterson, because it raises all sorts of questions about, if something isn't original, can it be regarded as sacred to a culture in terms of a story? But I'll talk about that. I think I actually just confused that with the use. I don't know. There's lots of questions. Crickford Live. Any other big questions? Add-ons, editors. I don't know. Calaventure mentioned. Well, there's lots of commentary with no questions. So, would you like me to do I'll do a very quick run over what a myth is for anyone who's new here. If people want to see that, I've made some slides. So I don't think you may have seen these before. I hope not. Let me just whiz down. Right, let me press my button if I've technically done this right. There we go. Right. So, what is the difference between history, myth, folklore, and legend? So, it's quite a simple thing if you break it down into its core pieces. So, if a story has a non-human character in it, it certainly isn't history or legend. If the non-human character is the lead character, so that can include divine people or semi-divine people, like demigods, then it's probably a myth. So we sometimes find that folklore can flirt between the two, but that's worth knowing. So if you've got a story you don't know if it's myth, ask yourself that. Next up is, where is the story told? So if the story is told in this world, then it is history or legend. But if it's on a different world, even if that world looks like our world, so we sometimes see a myth, it could be associated with particular places on Earth. It actually isn't those places on Earth because it contains either buildings or creatures that do not live on our Earth. So again, that's how you can distinguish between the two. An obvious one next is if it's historical or not. So if things are written prehistory, then they're almost certainly myth. Although we do find folklore written in prehistory, anything written in history is, well, history. And by that I mean anything that is written down at the time it happened. We called it history, or could be to some degree legendary because it could be written down in history but tweaked to exaggerate the parts of the story that the author wishes to exaggerate, to make him or the nation or the king look or queen look good. Next is it fiction or fact, which would be quite obvious, which is that if it's fact, then it is history. If it is fiction, then it's definitely folklore. But if it's potentially a mix of both, and this is quite a grey area, it could be considered myth or legend. And finally, and probably the most important piece is it sacred or not? So if the story is sacred, so if it contains a god or demigods, then it can be considered a myth. And this is really important. So, and probably the key distinguishing feature, that myths contain sacred truths. They could potentially contain historical truths, but they will always contain a sacred truth. So truth about the demigod or god involved in that myth. So let me get my screen back. There we go. I saw a question come up. Slander pass aside, I still like both Peterson and Hancock as human beings, striving towards ideals, principles, everything. In my opinion, sorry, I don't want to deal. That's fine, Howard. I'm not here to be derogatory to them. I think they both have good traits. So absolutely, I get that, and I'm here to say not make them look stupid. I'm here to try and allow people who listen to them to have more information, to question what they're saying, and maybe even in certainly Graham Hancock's example that I'm going to give, maybe help him. In Jordan Peterson's, it's a very different game because we're talking religion, and religion comes with sets of beliefs which aren't easily changed if you're dogmatic about those religious beliefs. So that's no problem at all. So I'm just to check for any other questions I can easily find. No, not okay. So who should I talk about first? Let's talk about Hancock. I think Hancock will be a good person to discuss first. So I've got a couple of notes just so I know what he's talking about. So Hancock, as I say, recently has been far more careful with what he says. So I mean, because we've got old videos of him talking about life on Mars and things like that, which obviously doesn't come up so much nowadays. But he's focusing now on, was there a ancient technologically advanced civilization before the Ice Age? And he isn't talking about lasers and necessarily mechanical machines, but they had a level of technical skills, maybe even metallurgy, and metal tools that then got lost until several thousand years ago when the Iron Age hit most of Europe. So that's his sort of hypothesis, that he believes there's something there, even though he's also said he has not seen evidence for that civilization yet. What he also says, and which is true as far as I'm aware, is that the oldest modern human is 300,000 years old and was found in Morocco. And we're also very much aware that humans, I mean, it's impossible to say who was the first modern human, because evolution changes things gradually. So you can't say that's the first modern human. There'll be a lot of grey area, and we see these humans, let's call them, whether they're modern or Neanderthal or Erectus, go in and out of Africa, across Eurasia, but basically it's down Eurasia and Africa, and they're intermingling and mixing, which means it's very hard for some people to say that humans come from out of Africa, where I think David Reich put it really well, succinctly. He said it wasn't so much about biological evolution, humans leaving Africa, that made a difference. It was a cultural thing, and that's something worth considering and remembering, is that a group of modern humans looked like they left Africa 70,000 years ago, that had a cultural advantage over other humans that had already left Africa and that were in Eurasia. And then what is even more interesting is that 45,000 years ago, there is a second dispersal, probably from Northeast Africa, maybe from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, that then has another significant cultural advantage, because that dispersal of humans literally wiped out every other type of human in Eurasia. They were the humans that wiped out the Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and anything else that was Denisovians and the like. So they were the sort of key. And he says it isn't a biological change that happened. It is they probably had a cultural thing going on, whether that's they can make fire more quickly or hunt more effectively. There was something going on there. So that's, again, really worth noting. But Hancock is of the belief that somewhere before that 45,000-year-old humans, or maybe after that, but certainly you've got 250,000 years before that he thinks humans may well have risen up and created a modern or a technologically advanced culture that is now lost, and that culture spread around the world because we see so many common things happening. We see common iconography, common myth, and so he feels that is likely to have come from an older civilization that was sitting on the world, that got lost, and those remnants of them managed to filter through to modern society. And that's interesting. But he also says, it is possible that people could have just come up with these ideas on their own. It's hard to tell. And then he talks about the Milky Way and how the Milky Way is seen as a sort of, in effect, a pathway to heaven when you die. And he says that's common across the world. And he thinks that, he uses that as a piece of evidence that, how can all these people think of the same thing? There must have been an older civilization that did that. Now, this is what I do. Anyone who follows me knows this is exactly what I do. In fact, what I will do is I will present a map of the Milky Way. Let me get ultra technical here. There we go. Hopefully you'll see that. So this is a distribution of the souls of the dead on the Milky Way. And this has got I-65 at the start of it. I-65 is the mythology database reference for the myth, and that shows the distribution of that myth. And as you can see, it's all over the Americas, and it's in Europe. See smatterings in Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and a couple in Australia. So it isn't quite everywhere, but there are reasons why that dispersal's happened. I mean, to me, looking at that, it's only in 93 traditions we record, and in the mythology database we record over 1,000 different traditions. So it is literally less than 10% of all the cultures we know tell this myth, which is one way of saying it, perhaps it isn't quite as widespread. And if I haven't researched this myth, by the way, but looking at dispersals using my experience, that looks like it was part of the second wave of human dispersal into Africa, because into the Americas. If it was part of the earliest migrations into America by humans from Eurasia across the Siberia, or the Beringia, as it would have been in the Ice Age, we would probably see more examples of it in the southern tips of South America, and possibly more in sub-Saharan Africa. But we don't see that, but we do see it in South America, which suggests it was part of a second dispersal. So maybe 20,000, 15 to 20,000 years old when that dispersal happened. The myth may be slightly older, but it certainly isn't an out of Africa type myth. Otherwise, we would see that absolutely everywhere. And I say, but this is what I do. So my proposal to Graham is that actually, I show that some myths do come up independently, but I have shown that many myths do have a common source. The mythology database is a huge tool for that. It's got now about 160,000 myths in it, spread over, categorized into over 3,000 categories, I say over 1,000 traditions. There's a lot of data we can use, and we can determine if a myth is probabilistically from a source or multiple sources or independent. And time again, we can show that some myths come from out of Africa at 70,000 years ago. Many myths are 45,000 years ago or younger, which is part of this second dispersal, which was culturally advanced and wiped out all humans, but previous humans, and some are younger. So this isn't part of a 300,000-year-old civilization or even a 100,000-year-old civilization. It is myths can grow and disperse really quickly. Humans move quickly, and once they knew how to sail boats and get across the Americas, myths dispersed rapidly. We see that we can show that with the will. I think the dispersed will. I think in space of 500 years, we see it disperse over a 2,000-mile radius when it's invented. I believe that was the numbers I heard from Reich. That's so. For 500 years, it travels a 4,000-mile journey. Just think what you can do over 5,000 years. So I think Hancock is right in the sense that myths can show that there was a source of information, a source myth, but I think he's very wrong in thinking it is far older than possible. I'd say most are 70 to 45,000 years old. If I knew how to talk to him, I probably would about that and give him a 3-hour lesson on the study of mythography, so he could understand that. So that's my view of Hancock. That I'm not going to discuss Atlantis and all these things. I mean, what I would say is that Hancock is a brilliant storyteller, and what he's exceptionally good at is finding correlations, and therefore suggesting correlations are also then causations. And we know that not all correlations are causations, but because he's a great storyteller, he can sort of weave these together really well, and that's what he does. I mean, we've got pyramids in Mexico and pyramids in Egypt, so they must be related. That's how he comes from, and I'm not going to talk about that. I mean, it should be fairly straightforward to talk about those or academics surrounding to show that they're not related. But in terms of myth, which I think is far more important, we have the tools and the data to show their origins. And I wish he was aware of that, because that would make more sense to people. It would be more, well, it is how we see things today, and so people might take his views on that more seriously if that's the case. Now, let me just have a quick sip of tea. It's probably cold. Oh, I do not like cold tea. Right. Let me just whiz through the chat, and as Crowhag has said, keep the chat respectful. I have no care for politics in this chat, so please keep it friendly and happy. Oh, we had a couple of questions. Let me whiz down. What's this? Oh no, that's, well, I think I already answered that question. Oh, another question. Oh, Howard again. Graham mended bridges with Zahir Hawass recently. Let me show this. But I could tell he swallowed his pride, as people speculate he only did it so he could return to Egypt. Yes, that is true. And we're finding that more and more. I'm seeing, in effect, team lead architects at various sites, even in Turkey, Anatolia, not wanting particular YouTubers turning up on site. Some YouTubers are taking photos of parts of the site they're not meant to and publishing them, and to them that hurts, one, tourism, which they rely on to help fund the digs, but it also could potentially hurt the research papers being written. So yes, I'd imagine there was part of that. I mean, there's a lot in Egypt that Graham likes, so without doubt he is, I think, yeah, as you say, reluctantly accepting, reluctantly apologising to Zahir Hawass. So, and as I say, he has been doing this certainly since April when he had the Flint double chat. He's been far more cautious in his wording. So yeah, that was interesting. Thanks, Howard. Thanks for that super chat. Yes, this stream will be available to watch later if anyone's asking that. Question: what about when a very similar story from different places around the world, or maybe even different time periods, seems to be retelling of the same story, where in one culture is thought of a myth, yet in another place it may be seen as fact or history? Right. It'd be good to have an example, but if the story contains gods, it's a myth. That's it. What we find is that people who are dogmatic about their religion will believe myth as fact. Like, so we have, I think Jehovah's Witnesses are one. I think we believe the Bible is literal. If someone can correct me on that, that'd be good. If that's wrong, so they consider the Bible fact, where someone like me would look at the Bible and it is just myth, as a story. That's how we sort of look at that. We don't see a myth as fact if it contains gods or isn't on this world or contains fictions. Because I don't know if you saw the beginning of this stream, Rune, but about probably 10 minutes ago, I talked about that. So what a myth is. So if you just run through that checklist, and that will help define it, whether it is a myth or whether it is historical. Let me whiz through. There's a lot of comments compressing. Yes, if you do have questions, if you write a question at the start, it'd be easier to stand out for me. I don't mind cold tea. Logan, I don't know what to say for that. I'm not a fan of iced tea or cold tea at all. In fact, any tea that isn't tea. Yes. Right. Samuel De Grandi has asked a question. John, being a fellow historian, do you feel like the area should focus more on prehistoric processes in order to understand a wider context and recurring patterns? Love your work and how serious it is. Samuel, for myths, you have to study prehistoric data. It's very unusual for us to get myths written in historical times, not brand new ones. How we get our data, in fact, what's probably better for people to understand is how we actually get the data in the mythology database is that people have traveled the world and collected stories. And what we've done is taken the stories we've collected before cultures have been influenced or as influenced as little as possible from external sources. And we use that as the repository for information. And so some of these stories may be taken 300-400 years ago, some maybe only 100 years ago, depending on where we find these cultures. And people can say, well, actually, then surely the story changes. And this is what some people don't necessarily understand about how we look at myth. So as a mythographer, we don't care for the detail of myth, which you may go, oh, what? Hey, how can you know what you're talking about then? We care about mythemes, we'd call them, or mythologems, but mythemes, it tends to be the key word used today. So if we look at a myth of Little Red Riding Hood is a good example, we would say the main character is a girl. She wears a red hood. The enemy is the fox. The hero is an axeman, and she is visiting her grandma. We would take points like that in the myth. And then if we see any other stories that have those exact points in, we could argue that story is similar. And that's how we compare similar myths. So we don't really care for all the details and expect the stories to be exactly the same. Certainly if Little Red Riding Hood wore a blue coat and came across an evil badger rather than a wolf, we could still call it the same and make notes that actually rather than it's a wolf who's the bad person, it is a quadruped or it's a mammal or something like that. We would try and find a attribute or set of attributes that would catch all in that situation, all sort of a similar variety of things. So that's how we do that, and that's how we know. And those aspects of myth really rarely change as myths evolve and go through time. So hopefully that makes sense to people. Let me just whiz through your life world. There are a few questions. I'll go through these properly at the end because the obvious questions are not about Mr. Peterson, who I really want to talk about next, because this is probably what a fair few of you are here for. I've got a couple of notes which I'll just put up about Mr. Peterson because I'm going to quote him on a few things, and that's quite important. Now, how did myths begin? And Jordan's view, or Mr. Peterson's view, Dr. Peterson, is that people, I'm going to read my notes to make sure I get this absolutely right. People behaved in a way that had a survival significance. So to survive, you had to do things. And one thing could be mortuary behavior. So if someone died, you'd bury their body. And you'd bury their body to stop predators either eating that body or following you. And people who carried on these behaviors tend to be selected for in the mating process because their behaviors allowed you to survive. I mean, the more likely you are to survive, the more likely you are to reproduce. And his view is that we have an ability to observe ourselves. And so we would see that a particular behavior was significant and helped our survival. And in effect, that became ritualized. And then stories around that ritual came to be. And that's his view on how stories came to be. And that is understandable and interesting. Certainly, when we see ritual today, ritual enacts myth. So the example I like giving is about sacrifice, human sacrifice, because it's a great family subject, which is that in the earliest creation myths we see around Eurasia, and particularly in the European, a giant or a human figure was sacrificed to make the world and make people. So when a human sacrifice happened, it was in effect a microcosm of this cosmic belief that they would enact. So they would say, "Oh, the head is, or the bones are rocks, and the flesh is the soil, and the hair is grass." And then they would give parts of the head, which was the most important bit, to the most important people, parts of the torso to warriors, and parts of the legs to the providers, the farmers, and the like. And so that by doing that, the story of the myth persists because people hear it again and associate it with things. Because people say, how can myths survive for a long time, without changing too much? And that is one of the things that ritual enacts the myth. And, certainly key core rituals enact the key core myths, and they're the ones that really do survive, such as human sacrifice. And in fact, if you, I don't know if it's Thanksgiving in America, but if you have Thanksgiving in America and you're standing at the end of your table, there's the head of the household is carving the turkey. The head of the household carving the turkey is very similar to the chief of a tribe sacrificing a human and offering out the bits to the most important people first, and then the next important people, and so on. And when you carve up your dinner, you sometimes follow suit. It's a bit weird, but there is evidence to suggest that is just a natural progression of human sacrifice. So have a think about that at Thanksgiving. So yes, it's probable that behaviors and certainly observations created stories, and then rituals started from that. And that I'm not too. I don't get overly irked about. I can understand where he's coming from with that. Now, what is more interesting though is when people start questioning him about Christianity, and this is. I'm not having a dig at Christianity. I know people think I do. I don't. I have Christian friends. I sent my kids to a Christian school. No problems with Christianity. Roman Catholic Church, I think, has done some bad things in its lifetime, which is odd for a very Christian organisation, but absolutely happy. So I'm not having a go at Christianity. I'm having a go at Jordan Peterson's understanding of what I consider myth in the Bible and how he sees it. So he was asked by Dawkins, I think it was, do you believe Jesus was born of a virgin? And Peterson's answer was quite interesting. It was, there are elements of the text I do not feel qualified to comment on, which seems quite an odd response, like there is something hidden in the text that he isn't aware of. And hold on to that, because we'll come back to that in a minute. He then also said, I know, for example, that any culture that doesn't hold the image of the woman and the infant sacred dies. And that's really interesting, because it was the conversion to Christianity that wiped out a lot of cultures that didn't have that as particularly sacred. Look at Charlemagne and again, the Germanic tribes, for example, absolute literal genocide going on there. So I'm not too sure whether Christians believing in a sacred mother and child was really the reasons that the sort of Indo-European belief, or the cultures died out or changed their beliefs. I think the reasoning was a bit more physical than that. But he does say something quite interesting, and I'm going to probably make a video about this, or I might write something about this, which he says that the passion of Jesus is, in effect, the ultimate hero's journey. And what that means is that there's a chap called Joseph Campbell who wrote A Hero with a Thousand Faces and suggested that all popular stories follow their particular cycle. And he was very much influenced by Jung, who is certainly an influence of Peterson, and certainly influenced people like Mircea Eliade, who Peterson has quoted a few times and commented on. And I do like Eliade's work. I think he's done some amazing stuff. But whether if he's saying that Jesus's story, Jesus's passion is a hero's journey, then he's saying it's almost been written as a story. It's not based on historical fact. Does that make sense? So if a story follows the hero journey, I mean, none of our stories, I think we live in life, follow the hero's journey, because if it did, we wouldn't get excited watching a story about it at the cinema, like a film about it, or reading a book about it. So if he's saying that the passion of Jesus is the ultimate hero's journey story, then that must have been fabricated in my eyes, because no one lives that story. Or if God is great and all powerful, he made Jesus follow that story, which is possible, but because I don't believe in God, I don't feel that part of the argument is valid. But again, what does he mean there? And I think it would have been good if Dawkins had picked him up on that, but because Dawkins doesn't necessarily understand what myth really is either, he didn't, and it would be interesting for someone to put that to him. So if you know anyone who can, please do. But it doesn't end there. So I don't know if people watched my video I did on, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, it may have been, where I talk about the Garden of Eden and the serpent and the tree of knowledge. And Jordan had a brilliant discussion with Alex O'Connor on that, which again irked me somewhat, about the importance of that story, how great it was that the biblical scholars had spent many generations formulating it and creating this wonderful story. And what did the serpent represent? Was it Jesus or the Antichrist or the devil? It's all very important that Adam and Eve committed a sin, and he was very brought into that story as it being like an ultimate story. And the thing is, I can give you examples of stories. If you belong to my Patreon, I've put papers up referencing them with the stories that make up the story of the Garden of Eden, from Africa, from the Ivory Coast to Ethiopia. We see stories where a snake wins a race and he wins immortality because the man stopped racing to lay with a woman. And we see a story where a man loses his immortality because he needs food, and so a snake gives him food, or death, I think it is, gives him food, and he takes the man's immortality. In effect, these stories are the snake in the Garden of Eden story. The snake gives food, and they eat it, they learn about sex, and God throws them out the Garden of Eden and takes away their immortality. That story is about the loss of immortality. Now, what I have to ask then is, how can a story in the Bible be sacred if it really is just a rehash of stories from older cultures that did not believe in God? Is that possible? It certainly can't be true, the story, because they're acknowledging that, or it's unlikely to be a true story, because what are the chances of the Garden of Eden being created with a real snake in it and a real tree of knowledge and acting out exactly the same story as exists in cultures before that time? So that's something worth noting. And again, I wish someone challenged Peterson on how can the Bible have a sacred story if it's taken from elsewhere. And if, I don't know if Captain Dadpool's on here, because I know he's did a lot of research, but if there are any biblical scholars on here, I'd be quite interested in understanding that. Now, what he also says, when he's talking to Jonathan Pageau, he's talking about how can the Bible, let me get the exact quotes right. So, if you hope you don't mind me reading these, this is exact quoting from Jordan Peterson, and then I can talk about that. The insipid thing hiding behind the idea that, for example, the crucifixion, that the resurrection or the virgin birth didn't happen, is that someone lied. And that's a big deal because, okay, so that means that our civilization is based on a lie. Okay, so there are implications to the fact that our culture is based on a lie that people told for power and prestige. That is exactly the postmodern Marxist critique. and the cancer that's eating the universities that Richard Dawkins loves is predicated on exactly that viewpoint. And this Christian story handles that problem in its very structure, which is that it kind of sucks for them, but all of Jesus's disciples were killed, all of Jesus's disciples were imprisoned, tortured, and killed. And so in the structure of the Christian story, the idea that they would have lied in order to gain for themselves any kind of prestige and power, and that they all died holding on to that story, and all of them tortured and killed, is a pretty interesting idea. Now, that blows my mind. Let me explain why. So Jordan, who can't answer whether the virgin birth actually happened, is now inferring it's a lie. But more importantly, he's inferring that the disciples were real, witnessed it, and really died. So he's actually saying that what happened in the New Testament regarding the life of Jesus actually happened. The disciples were real, and they went through those things. So if he's saying that, why can't he say the virgin birth is true? Where to me, it's a myth. It's a story, as we said, hero's journey. It doesn't make sense. So he's sort of not quite contradicting himself, but he's giving he's not being consistent in his views on that. So I would love someone again to put that to him, because I think that's really quite interesting. Yes. So I'll pause there a second because there's lots of chat going on. I see History with Hilbert. Hello, History with Hilbert. Subscribe to him if you like Frisian things and other things around the area of the Netherlands. Absolutely fascinating chap. I'll just whiz through some questions. So if you put a question at the start, it will help me a lot to pick them out. Oh my God, you lot have talked lots. Right, so if I miss your question, then don't feel free to write it again. Do also be part of my steam tools. Peterson. I'm going to write. I cannot see any thing. Oh, there's an interesting one. Math is fun. Isn't a particular piece, but Graham Hancock often uses something about the dimensions of the pyramid when used with the precession information of the sun, which is something like 72, that they are 99% aligned. Just to let you know that literally anything when times by a precession number, i.e. a number that can be aligned to the precession, can be about 99% plus accurate. So that really has no value at all, but he makes it feel like it does. So that's an interesting piece there. And I think it was Flint Dibble, I think, did raise that when he's talking to him. It's all came from Native Americans. So this is a comment I'm a bit concerned about. Absolutely not. So we have a mythology database. It is free to use if everyone hasn't seen it. mythologydatabase.com. All you have to do is provide your email address. I don't email you at all, apart from giving you a link to sign on, and that's it. I haven't a mailing list or anything like that. And then you can search for these things, and you can actually see if there are myths in places, but not in the Americas. How can the myth have come from the Americas? Just saying. So a bit more thought there. I just can't see any questions. This is oh right, here we go. Here's one. Right, hi John. Are there any specific myths that have more harmful, dangerous effects on cultures than others? Perhaps motifs which, when occurring, coexist with a particularly unhealthy social structure? Well, that really depends on your morals, I think, Ethan. So I'm pretty sure myths around human sacrifice aren't particularly tickety-boo, as we would say here in sunny England, which isn't really sunny at the moment. But but I would say anything that promotes killing or promotes racial or ethnic bias is bad. And as I mentioned at the start, the whole study of mythology really helped promote nationalism. So actually, not only were the myths bad, but the studying of where the myths came from is bad as well. It's it's a double whammy of tragedy, really. But what was the worst myths? I think it's got to be those that promote sort of genocide, and death. They're the worst ones. So yeah, there are many of those. And again, mythology database, just do a search, look for. I mean, you probably wouldn't have genocide, but certainly, if you look for battles or things like that, then you may and look for a particular region. So in fact, I could show. Would people want me to show you how to use the mythology database, or are you all good with that? I don't know. Let me just do Mr. True. So here's Curtis. So myths are true stories that the collective mind evolved into spiritual entities. These are true mythos. This you have to be really specific here. So myths are basically science before science. They were the reason the universe was as it was. The cosmos, the life was as it was. Reason why things happened. And then their myths just changed due to the landscape of society. So if you're by the beach, your myths would probably involve the sea. If you're inland, they may involve mountains or whatever. If you're in a large community, you'll probably have, in effect, personified gods and the like. So again, I'm not overly convinced with that. I'd like to hear more why you think that. So what's Carrie and Cross? A quick avoid. Have you ever done deep dives into plays or fables specifically? Not particularly plays or fables. Mainly the data in the mythology database, because as I say, we've got some good data there. Now, there is a categorization of folk tales. In fact, there's three categorizations of folk tales. There's the Thompson Index, the Sith Thompson Index, and the Anna Thompson Uth Index. The Sith Thompson and Anna Thompson, and then there's the Anna Thompson Uth Index. And the ATU, the last one, is the latest one, and there's various feelings on the benefits of that. But basically, folklore has been categorized. The problem is that it's categorized on the detail. So where the myths aren't categorized on detail, so we can follow them, and that's really beneficial for following myths across landscapes, across continents. By having detail when a myth changes because of landscape or society, or when a folktale changes because of landscape or society, that data is lost. So it's quite difficult to do deep dives on folklore. But saying that, if there's a myth that seems like folklore, because you have got things like Cinderella and that has as myth, I think it's called the Princess Loses a Shoe is the motif or something like that. But there's others, the Jack and the Ogre or something. It's like Jack and the Beanstalk. There are myths out there which may follow that. But no, I haven't done folklore because it's incredibly challenging and the data is limited. But I mean, people do argue from the folklore as society against that, because obviously they love their indexes. But it's down to the individual to decide what is the best categorization they wish to use for the data they wish to use. So the question, here's another question. Are there any specific myths or motifs which are associated with... we've done that one, sorry. Not paying attention, chaps. And ladies... I'm just... I'll find out who love... Cool. You've been very busy talking in chat. Excellent. Right. Well, I think that's all the questions. I didn't see anyone say they wanted to look at the mythology database. So if that's case, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I can wrap it up. I've been talking for about an hour. I haven't really gone off topic too much. Last shout. Use that. Let's keep them with. Oh, here's a question. Jordan Peterson talks about red apples and snakes against the evolution of human eyesight. Does that hold weight? So it holds weight with dragons. So what we see is that there is some psychoanalytics, I guess you'd call it, done on the human mind, that humans or mammals have evolved to recognize snakes and be very aware of them in our peripheral vision. And when we see something we're scared of, we also exaggerate its size within our mind. So if you see a little snake about that big, or spiders are a good one, actually. If you ask people don't like spiders, there may be a spider that big, and when it's reported to you, let's say your wife has found a spider in the bathroom, she may say it's that big when it's actually that big. And so there is psychology around snakes being dangerous or creepycrawlies being dangerous, and that applies. And so we think that's the reason why the serpent turned into the dragon, which became the monster of many a myth. And certainly colours mean things to people. Even now, there's a lot of psychology over colours. Red is seen as either blood or on the body that someone is sexually. Is active the word? But yes, that's not my sort of area of expertise. But yes, there are some things out there that are part of our psychology, which are in myth, and dragons is one of them. So thanks for that question. Questions. What are your thoughts on Robert Graves? I have a few of his books. No problem with those at all. Calling question. I know you predominantly have spoken about pioneer videos. I'm wondering if you have any knowledge on proto-language groups. I have a slight knowledge on, Asiatic, I mean, the pre-Proto-Indo-European language. So I'm fascinated by our earliest words. So I was going to do a video on this, but I haven't, so I can tell you now. Which is that I've done a video on some of the oldest words, which was you, me, I, mum. But then there were three other words, which I think were bark, ash, and worm. And they're really interesting because they must be really important if those words have persisted throughout sort of linguistic evolution across multiple cultures outside the Indo-Europeans. And worm's really interesting because worm is the term used for serpent or dragon. So it sounds like, it's extra evidence that people were talking about dragons 15,000 years ago or so. But the oldest word we know is one, the number one. However, we don't call it one. It has evolved in European languages as digit. But certainly we see the etymology of the word one go back probably 20,000 years or so, based on the languages spoken by the cultures that would have dispersed that time ago. So that's all I really know. I don't know if we'll ever be able to find out anymore. I think a lot of research and lots of data has been crunched. We may come up with one or two more words, maybe what we call ultra-conserved words that have sort of remained consistent. But I'm not aware of anything else going on at the time in the terms of that research. Great discussion. Thank you for your thank yous, everyone. Much appreciated. So this is my first ever live stream on my own, and I have very little idea what I'm doing. Loads of people talking about question. There's a question. Just get along. Question. Does the channel have a video about that? I can't find one. I don't know what you're talking about, Jess, but just go to my channel. I was thinking actually of making an index on the subject matter my videos cover, if that's useful to people. and I could put it on the mythology database, for example, or the crackenfold.com website. So if that's useful for people wanting particular videos about subject, finding them easily, I could do that. Right. Another question from Jeff Simpson Scott. Question: if there had been an ancient civilization destroyed by a cataclysm, how would it show up in our mythology, please? Are there any motifs which show it? So are we talking, I mean, well, what we do is we look at the dispersal of myth. So if there are irregularities in the dispersal pattern of myth, then we would have to question why. So myths tend to disperse in a very particular way. They come out of, the oldest myths come out of Africa into Eurasia, spread across Eurasia, into North America, and down Southeast Asia into Oceania, and they carry on down into the Americas. But as they hit America, we start seeing another set of myths coming out of, I guess, near the Caspian Sea, the Volga region, maybe you could call it Western Siberia, Central Asia, that then spread out and cover all of East Eurasia, North America, North Africa, so where the Sahara is rather than sub-Saharan Africa, and then go into the Americas and go down, not completely into South America, but a fair amount, and don't really go into Oceania. So with experience, you can see these patterns quite clearly in the dispersal patterns in the mythology database. If a pattern doesn't look right, so sometimes we see a myth that's in Europe and in the Americas, but not in Asia. And we've got to think, why is that? And that is because that maybe another myth has come along that has overtaken that with a different motif, and that's why the original myth has disappeared. But then you've got to ask yourself, is it a different culture that has done that, or is it the same culture? And that's where we rely on archaeology and sort of linguistic evolution and other data to provide confidence in the results we give you. I would never just use data from the mythology database and say, with just this data, this is true. I'd like to know that we have human dispersal data of how cultures migrated that support that. So that's how we would do that. So we found a myth, would go to other data, and the other data then supported that irregularity, that anomaly in the data, then we may see it that way. I hope that helps. Questions. Cool. So questions. Wonderful live stream. Thank you. Thanks for job on the stream today. Thank you. Well, thanks. History of Hilbert. Glad you enjoyed it. I didn't think you'd like my sort of stuff, but excellent stuff. Well, if you want to catch up separately, happy to do that. Yes. I'm going to follow up. Sort of talking to myself, sorry about that, as I whiz through the questions, which there aren't really any outstanding. I'll keep the questions going. Don't let him leave. Thanks, Ethan. So, but there aren't any more questions. Excellent, Hilbert. Yeah, so with that then, because it is Sunday evening here, it's quite late, and I should get some sleep, and I've got to make a video. I'm actually away for a little while at the end of the week, so I've got a week, well, 3 days, in fact, to make my next video, which is going to be about why dragons breathe fire. So if you're interested in that, that'll be my next video, and then I don't know what I'm doing after that. I don't, as I often change subject mid-talk, so who knows, it'll be a surprise. But thank you for all the great questions. Thank you for all your support. Thank you for the great chats you're having. There seems to be lots going on. I'm quite touched, really, that people want to listen to me. So yes, thank you so much. I'll leave it there, and I hope you all have a great week or two to see me next on video. If you want to support me, I do have a Patreon. It does have a free tier. If you can't afford to support me but want to see a vlog every week, that's no problem. Mythology database is free to use. And with that, I want to say thank you very much, and stay safe and well, and grab yourself a cup of tea. Oh, it's Christmas soon. Buy a Crackenfold mug. I don't actually make money on these, but they're great presents. drink anything you want out of them. Marvelous. But yeah, with that, yes, take care, and I'll see you all soon. Okay, toodle pip.